this is a quotation that I'm starting with, and it matches this, the picture of departing emigrants. Good heavens, what sorrows bloomed that parting day, that called them from their native walks away, when the poor exiles, every pleasure past, hung round their bars, and fondly looked their last, and took a fond farewell, and wished in vain for homes like these beyond the western main, and shuddering still to face the distant deep, returned and wept, and still returned to weep. In 1972, the Reverend Hugh Mullen published a history of the parish of Aghadowey, which, for those of you who are unfortunate enough not to know it, lies west of the River Bann, about 5 miles from Ballymoney. The book contains lists of the names of inhabitants of the locality at various dates from official records. And I first read the book as a teenager, and I was very intrigued, even as a teenager, by family history and to see the names of my own ancestors, the Torrens family, in townlands called Meochel and Kahini in the 1663 subsidy roll. So they had been there in that area since at least 1663. And lots of other local names that I was familiar with were still in the townlands that the record showed them in the 1660s and through 1740s. And the feeling of continuity and persistence and permanence in a locality had a very strong emotional appeal for me, as it still does. A family staying in the one townland for generations. However, the Reverend Mullen had a chapter on the emigration from Londonderry in the early 18th century. And for the first time as a teenager, I understood that not everybody had been able to stay in Aghadowey or in all the other parishes and townlands of Ireland. It had not been covered in the school history syllabus that I had just completed, but I suppose I had been aware of emigration from Ireland to wherever. Of course, I knew people who had made their lives in America and Canada and Australia. And when I started thinking about it, I realized that at that time they were still alive. 4 of my mother's 8 uncles and aunts, 4 of them were living in New York City. They had had to leave Ireland. And emigration suddenly became a reality for me. The story of Aghadowey has been important ever since, highlighting as it does the tragedy of emigration. And emigration had one of its beginnings in Ireland from Aghadowey in 1718. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about local causes and local effects of what, by any standards, was a momentous event in the history of Ireland and in the history of America. And that 1718 was the start of the main flow of emigration, of organised emigration. In the early 1700s, times were hard in Aghadowey and elsewhere. The sacrifices made and the losses incurred by the ordinary people, as well as by minor gentry in the Williamite Wars and in the Siege of Derry, had not been satisfactorily recompensed. A man called David Cairns, who was a merchant in Derry City and a prominent defender of the city, died in 1722. He was a bitterly disappointed man. His expenses in supporting the siege, and he travelled to London in search of supplies in what he said were sore and most dangerous journeys, and he'd organised bringing supplies. He'd also had property looted and property destroyed in the wars, and he claimed almost £9,000 in contemporary money, and that would be hundreds of thousands today, and they never got a penny of it back. Cairns put all of that money to help his neighbours and his friends, and he never got a penny from the government. Lower ranks too felt hard done by. A surviving document records that men from Captain Moore's company that was raised in County Tyrone, including drummers and corporals, so the ordinary soldiers, they tried to get unpaid back pay. They sent an agent to London who petitioned Queen Anne herself. And after all of that, the Captain Moore's company got £30, and they were wronged in, as they said, another 45 that was owed to them. So they got less, much less than they felt they deserved. And I would remark that the Siege of Derry, which has been so important subsequently, and right up to the present day in Protestant mythology and self-belief, might have had a very different resonance for the people who lived through it and who lived afterwards. In many cases, the esprit de corps and the loyalties generated during the ghastly experiences in the walled city seem to have continued strongly afterwards. People did bond together because of what they had been through. But there was also great disillusionment with the establishment, with the government, even with the crown for which they had been fighting, and a feeling of not being recognised for suffering and for their commitment might have contributed to the decisions that they took in 1718. 50 years after the successful efforts of King James I and VI and the London Parliament and the London companies to plant the north of Ireland with Protestants, the Irish government, then based in Dublin, no longer cared, or perhaps had never cared very much, whether or not the Scots in Ulster, who were almost all Presbyterians, were thriving. The state-backed denomination, the Episcopalian Church of Ireland, actively disliked Presbyterianism, and I would have to say the feeling was mutual. After the passing of the Hated Test Act in 1704, Presbyterians had no role in public life unless they were prepared to conform to Anglicanism. Alexander Lecky, who was an Aghadowey man and was a merchant in Derry City, he had been an alderman in Derry until 1704, when he was forced to resign because he would not take communion in the Church of Ireland. In Lecky's will, which was dated 1717, more than 20 years after the siege, he mentioned the debt due to me by the Crown for services, sufferings and provisions for the siege of Londonderry. He had freely given goods and food to the people while he could, while there was food to be given out, and he hoped that he would get recompense for this. He hoped that since it had not been paid to him, the debt would be paid to his descendants, but it presumably never was. There was another local grievance, and that was tithes. Presbyterians had always had to pay tithes to support the Church of Ireland, which grievously annoyed them. A 1725 report to the Ironmonger Company in London, the London Company which owned much of the land of Aghadowey, noted that in Aghadowey, tithes were collected in so rigorous a manner as is not known and scarce would be believed in England. So there were much stiffer penalties for not paying tithes than the English people would have known. There were also existing and feared prospective changes in the law regarding the status of Presbyterian ministers, and that would call into question the legality of marriages conducted by Presbyterians. There were other legal and social stigmas, and undoubtedly these rankled with Presbyterians locally. But historians are fairly sure that in most cases economic factors were the main cause of dissatisfaction. The expanding population in the north of Ireland was putting pressure on the availability of land. And as we all learned in first year economics, if demand and supply get out of kilter, somebody is going to profit. And in this case, the middlemen and proprietors felt that they could squeeze higher rents out of the people. The Church of Ireland Archbishop King, writing in 1718, claimed that the Presbyterians never thought of leaving the kingdom until they were oppressed by excessive rents. Obviously, as a Church of Ireland clergyman, King did not focus too much on the tithe grievance. And 10 years later, Archbishop Boulter, the Archbishop of Armagh, noted that the farmers and poorer tenants often had only a third of the profits from their farms after they paid rent, and sometimes only a fourth or a fifth. The tithe came out of whatever profit was left after the rent had been paid. And again, of course, for obvious reasons, Boulter didn't stress the tithe aspect of the economic situation. At the same time, there were epidemics of cattle disease and harvest failure. The new Bishop of Derry in 1718, William Nicholson, in his diocese found dismal marks of hunger and want, and he said it was the brink of a famine. So times were really hard for everyone in 1718. And the response seems to have been led by Presbyterian ministers, as well as the merchant class to whom they were all related. Or the elite in the north of Ireland were the minor gentry, the merchants, and the Presbyterian ministers. A landlord in a place called Fort Stewart, which is in County Donegal, as opposed to Port Stewart, which is in County Derry, Ezekiel Stewart complained, "Presbyterian ministers have taken their share of pains to seduce their poor ignorant hearers by bellowing from their pulpits against the landlords and the clergy, calling them rackers of rents and screwers of tithes." And Stewart said there are two of these preachers carried this affair to such a length that they went themselves to New England and carried numbers with them. And this is a reference to the emigration in 1718. We don't know if ministers did indeed preach from the very pulpit about economic grievances. What is certain is that the rhetoric of Presbyterian leaders in the run-up to these first organised emigrations in 1718, for obvious reasons, the rhetoric of the Presbyterian ministers stressed religious dissatisfactions current among their people, and possibly exaggerated the desire for religious freedoms. This would be a Presbyterian minister's view of the realities of life. The reliance on finding a promised land where there would be freedom to worship picks up themes that were familiar to everyone who read scripture, and every Presbyterian was supposed to do that. The leaders of 1718 may have, consciously or unconsciously, sought an exodus that would prevent violent upheavals in society, and would at the same time have allowed them to maintain leadership roles. And speaking of leadership roles, memories of the rebellion of 1641 in Ireland and of the Covenanters rising in Scotland at the end of the 17th century were still fresh enough. And if push came to shove, ministers would probably rather have seen themselves as Moses, the honoured patriarch of a freed people, rather than seeing themselves sharing the fate of the Reverend James Renwick, the Covenanting leader executed by the government in 1688. Certainly, James MacGregor, the Presbyterian minister of Aghadowey, actively played up the motive of the promised land and of his leadership of a dispossessed people. He used biblical imagery to strengthen the resolve of his community. He could have used many quotations from the Bible in support of departure. If you look at Genesis, Genesis says, "Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation." Texts like these would have been daily reading for MacGregor's hearers and all the families from the other congregations. Apparently MacGregor's final sermon in Aghadowey was on a text from Genesis chapter 33, in which the Israelites are told by the Lord to depart and go up hence, unto a land flowing with milk and honey. MacGregor is said in his sermon to have reminded his people that they were departing to avoid oppression and cruel bondage, secondly, to shun persecution and designed ruin, thirdly, to withdraw from the communion of idolaters, and fourth, to have freedom to worship. An unknown number of people, perhaps about 200 from Aghadowey and other Ban Valley areas around Ballymoney and Coleraine, gathered together to make the incredibly arduous journey with bag and baggage to Boston in the summer of 1718. The story of their departure from the north coast, which according to tradition was in 5 small ships, is much better known in history than it was when I first encountered it in the Reverend Munn's book in 1972. So I'm not going to follow them in their peregrinations and trials, fascinating though those are. I will remark that it must have taken all of MacGregor's undoubted leadership ability to keep the small community together. The shocks and the grievous suffering, the distressing circumstances of their arrival, the lack of welcome from the government of Massachusetts. Massachusetts had been settled by the English Puritans, and they were not especially keen on Presbyterians either. It was bitterly cold. They arrived in time for winter, which is not too clement in New England. Their ship was frozen into the sea ice. They weren't allowed to leave their ship because no land had been given to them. It was, you might say that it was promised land that was not fulfilled. It was a howling wilderness where they were expected to settle. There was Indians, French, snakes, weather. It is even recorded that the settlers were so unwelcome to the local English that when a boatload of women and children on their way for their first time to the land they had expected to get, they were crossing the River Merrimack and overturned into the water, the locals on the bank jeered and ridiculed them. MacGregor is said to have preached a sermon standing under a tree in the middle of the wilderness into which they had been pushed out by the Massachusetts government. American historians, and here I'm going to get a bit insulting, American historians, or some American historians I should say, tend to interpret MacGregor's sermon as thanksgiving for having reached safety and destiny in the promised land. And in my opinion, MacGregor's sermon is anything but that. And it's another example of the history of our emigrants being viewed in a viewpoint from the other side of the Atlantic. Some historians clearly regard emigration, leaving Ireland, coming to America, as a positive step. And why wouldn't they? No emigration, no America. I would make an exception for Edward Parker, the 19th century historian of Londonderry, New Hampshire. He at least realised and acknowledged that the early settlers did indeed regret leaving Ireland. Even Parker, however, is not able to free himself from the prevalent view, and he comments that the emigrants, even if they were miserable when they arrived, they should have realised how wonderful America was going to become. MacGregor's text was from a chapter of Isaiah, chapter 32, verse 2. The text itself is a bit difficult to understand, it's a bit opaque. This is it. And a man shall be as a hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. Not quite clear why he picked that text or what his sermon might have been like, but he probably interpreted the man, meaning Christ, prophesying Christ's millennial return to rescue his people. With so little other comfort available, MacGregor was holding out the promise that Christ's second coming would rescue the believers from the powerless conditions in which the new community found itself. From where they were standing in summer 1719, in a thickly forested wilderness full of snakes and ticks and mosquitoes and Native Americans and Catholic Frenchmen and wild animals, with no guarantee at all that they would be granted any land, and fears about whether or not they would have religious freedom in a Puritan state, it must have appeared to them all that they had made completely the wrong, irreversibly bad decision, and were much, much worse off than they had been in Ireland. I think we can gather something of this from looking at the context of the verse, as well as the verse itself, that MacGregor was preaching from. Apparently, it was customary, at least in Scotland in the 17th century, for the precentor of the church to read several chapters of the Bible from around the text, even before the minister preached. Whether or not that happened in Aghadowey or standing under a tree in what became Nutfield, New Hampshire, I don't know. But I'm sure that people would have been expected to read those chapters at home, if they could. The Isaiah chapter immediately before MacGregor's text begins with the admonition, "Woe to them that go down to Egypt for help," possibly suggesting to the readers in Nutfield that the transfer to America was in fact like returning to slavery in Egypt, rather than a move to the promised land of Canaan. The actual chapter from which the minister preached that day in 1719 contains other grim prophecies. "Upon the land of my people shall come up thorns and briars, because the palaces shall be forsaken, the multitude of the cities shall be left, the forts and towers shall be dens forever, a joy for wild asses." MacGregor's text from Isaiah was not chosen by a preacher exulting in new opportunity for his flock. Mind you, almost any text from Isaiah would have a similarly desolate import, and anyone who preaches from Isaiah is not feeling cheerful. What is significant is that MacGregor and the other leaders of the group had decided to leave Ireland before their emissary, the Reverend William Boyd, returned from a fact-finding mission to Massachusetts. He was from McCosquin, and they'd sent him out ahead to look for the opportunities that they would find in New England. That's one page of some of the people who signed the commission that they sent with William Boyd. And that's another page, the signatories of the people who were interested in transferring to New England. Boyd had been received politely by the Puritan clergy in Boston, but he wasn't coming home with much else positive to report about land grants or anything else that was useful for a fledgling promised land. And I think it's significant that Boyd, having seen the situation for himself, he came back to Ireland, found that the rest of them hadn't waited for him, but he did not follow them back across the Atlantic to New England. Instead, he contented himself for many years as minister in Taboyne and Donegal. He did not go back to New England. If the congregation of Aghadowey and McCosquin and Balmoney, if they had waited for Boyd's report before they went to America, how very different history might have been. The history that did happen was that at first a trickle and then a flood of emigrants left the north of Ireland. People in the 17th and 18th century were tuned into the Israelite nomadic shepherd mindset of the Old Testament and the Bible injunctions to go out and find a promised land. They were already accustomed to the idea that all problems would be solved by moving on, as the nomad shepherds did when wells went dry or their neighbours became unfriendly. The 1718 emigration would have been even more numinous in contemporary thought, because Ulster observers would have seen it in terms of a flock following a shepherd to better pasture. The people who were still in situ in North County Londonderry were not to know how bitterly those who had left might have been regretting the move. Even 80 or 100 years later, the country round Londonderry, New Hampshire, was still, it is said, a most wretched place indeed, miserable huts on very poor, rough, rocky ground. But even if conditions were still very poor and rough in the new land, as they were for several generations afterwards, very often, I would point out, very often in emigrant letters, a positive picture is transmitted to the folk back home to reassure them, and perhaps also in hopes that the positive spin will influence other people from home to come and join the emigrant party, to reform the family and community in a strange land. Archbishop Hugh Boulter, admittedly a man with very vested interests, recognised the symptoms of emigration madness for what it was in 1728, 10 years later. The humour has spread like a contagious distemper, and the people will hardly hear anybody that tries to cure them of their madness. The worst is that it affects only Protestants and reigns chiefly in the north, the seat of our linen manufacture. You can see Boulter was worrying about his tithes. Calculations of numbers suggest that anything from 10,000 people a year left Ireland in the 1770s, and that continued for the rest of the 18th century. And different kinds of emigration continued throughout the 19th century and the 20th century and right up to today. As well as the emigrants suffering the miseries of being uprooted and having to start again to create a community in New Hampshire, their departure from Ireland brought huge disadvantages to the home place. Away with all these people went whatever capital they could raise, their skills, their energy, their education, the opportunities, the very tools which they used for their trades and manufactures. People even brought away their looms in pieces. Speculating about what would have happened in history if something else had not happened is not well regarded. It's the kind of thing people have, history students, shall we say, have fun talking about late at night after a good dinner at a history conference. It's not well regarded in proper academic circles. But I want to challenge you to think about it for a moment. Opportunities lost to Ireland with the 18th century emigrants and their skills at this crucial time when industrial development was just beginning, that might well have changed the course of economic and social history here. People landing in New Hampshire with their goods and their education and their enthusiasm, surely that was America's gain and Ireland's loss at a very critical period of economic history. The rocky fields of New Hampshire, not that there even were any fields in 1718, offered nothing more than County Londonderry in terms of resources or climate, and probably in fact a good deal less. I would urge us to consider the history of a parallel universe where things might have been very different if so many people had not abandoned Ireland in 1718 and thereafter. John Pinkerton, who was probably from the Ballymoney area, and more than likely one of my many times great uncles, should have founded the famous Pinkerton Academy. In Ballymoney, where he himself was educated, and not in Derry, New Hampshire. This fine house of Archibald McFedris might have been built in the port town of Coleraine rather than in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I made an interesting discovery when I started preparing these slides. I was wanting to back up my point about the loss of talent and energy to Ireland, and I was just looking for any random impressive building from early 18th century New Hampshire and found this picture, this McFedris house. I'd never heard of it. On the accompanying website, Archibald is said to be from Antrim or from Londonderry, Antrim. A day or two later, for another purpose, I was looking for a slide of Ballymoney. I found this possibly familiar picture of Ballymoney. And by coincidence, I stole this from a website, a very good website called Eddie's Extracts, which contains extracts from a book called A Short History of the Presbyterian Churches of Ballymoney by the Reverend Dill and other ministers. I'm not sure whether this picture is from that actual book, but on the same page of the website, there were names of elders of the Presbyterian Church in Ballymoney in the very early 18th century, and one of them jumped out of the page at me. Gilbert McFedrick, or McFedricks, the name occurs in both forms. I went back to the New Hampshire website to look at the information about Archibald McFedricks in New Hampshire, and lo and behold, he had a brother called Captain Gilbert McFedris, who arrived in Piscataqua in July 1722 with 200 Irish emigrants. I don't know for sure, but I would suggest that Archibald and Gilbert McFedris, or McFedricks, or McFedridge, as they would be here, I would say they were brothers and that they were possibly sons of Gilbert McFedrick of Ballymoney. So maybe Archibald's fine house could also have been in Ballymoney. Personal opinion, speculation, biased analysis, prejudice, vague generalizations. This paper is full of them. And these failings are not well regarded by historians of emigration, or indeed by any historians. But emigration is an unavoidable elephant in the room in Irish history. After the exodus of 1718, emigration has continued to scar every generation since. And again, families were separated by thousands of miles of ocean and later by even more miles of territory as they travelled across America, Canada, Australia, Argentina, New Zealand. I want to take a look at one family from the Aghadowey area to see the patterns that affected all the rest of the community. The Rankins of Lisboy in Aghadowey. David Rankin emigrated from Scotland in 1685 and died in Aghadowey in 1750. He probably went through the siege of Derry. Apparently his sister Margaret was shot during the siege carrying food to the soldiers. Family trees of his descendants fill 4 pages in Mullen's History of Aghadowey. The trees are annotated showing what happened to the family members. Information perhaps not complete, because I think some of the first settlers of Londonderry, New Hampshire, a Hugh and a Samuel Rankin, are somewhere on that. That's a map of the land that was allotted in Londonderry, New Hampshire, around 1720. But of the Rankins born in Lisboy and also in Heathfield in Aghadowey in the 18th and 19th centuries, half of every generation That's 1 out of every 2 people in that family definitely emigrate, perhaps more. Not all of them are recorded. But we know that Rankins went to California, to Philadelphia, to Melbourne, Australia, to Durham in England, to Toronto, Taormina in Sicily, and especially to St. Louis in Missouri. Over 2 generations, 9 Rankins born in Aghadowey ended up in Missouri, where they prospered. That we must not forget that they prospered. But what does losing half of your family do to that family? What does it do to parents to know that half of their children will leave home and will never come back, and there will never be any way of knowing, even if they succeeded in life, if they had children, or did they die on the voyage? That is at least as bad as losing children by death. Maybe it's worse. It's an uncertainty. What does that amount of loss do to a congregation and a neighbourhood and a country? Think about the money and effort invested in feeding and educating half of each generation, who then go away and do not pay back their home community by taking their turn to bring up the next generation. People talk about money sent back by immigrants. That's fine, it's useful, but it's not the same as a lifetime of involvement in a community where you contribute every day to the economy and to social life and to relationships. It's a loss that is unrecognised. Even today, when emigration from Ireland is still a burning issue, most of the coverage in newspapers looks at the pain suffered by immigrants and not so much at the loss suffered by the communities from which they came. In the 14th century in Europe, 1/3 of 1 generation of Europeans died in a few years in the Black Death, the plague. And historians say that this destabilised society, it helped end feudalism, it's all kinds of social and economic results. Losing up to a half of each generation, every generation, for 300 years, what will that have done to society in Ireland? Maybe Northern Ireland's traumas finally came home to roost in our generation with the disastrous experience of the Troubles. The heart has been pulled out of our society for 300 years. The approach of the years 2018 and 2019 will mark 300 years since our relatives left Ireland and founded Londonderry, New Hampshire, and began emigration. There had been emigration before, but this was the first organised exodus. There are people, some in this room, a few of you I see that I know, and there are probably others, are planning to try to organise suitable events and projects to mark this. To these people who are planning, and to anyone else creatively employed on heritage and arts projects, I would urge the need to commemorate 1718, not to celebrate it. In the same way that we do not celebrate, but instead commemorate the victims of world wars. It seems to me that suitably commemorating the events of 300 years ago should focus on the pains of emigration, on the amount of suffering, direct and indirect, caused by departures. In my opinion, it is deplorably bad psychology for Irish Ulster people when they are sightseeing in their own country to see mainly signboards and museum exhibitions that are celebrations of the successes of the people who left Ireland. It would be a useful corrective to display materials in museums and tourist sites that look at emigration from the perspective of the people who remained in Ireland. And here I want to add another personal comment. The whole vocabulary in which we discuss emigration is permeated through and through with the perspective of the receiving society. In other words, from an American viewpoint. When I first wrote that paragraph myself, I wrote, from the perspective of the people who were left behind. I read through it again just before I printed it off, and I realised that using these words, the people who were left behind, insidiously validates the attitude which regards Ireland as the place that one has to leave to go somewhere more important. It can't be just a question of changing the focus. Obviously, for tourism potential, we want to highlight the American celebrities who came directly or by descent from a very small population here in the north of Ireland. But it would be a more positive message for people here if we can research and add to the record, for instance, information about a brother or a nephew who established a flax mill in Ballymoney, or if we highlight the Bushmill school teacher or the Ballybrushane minister who gave the emigrant his education or her religious faith. And we might mention the family friend who provided the suit of clothes that the emigrant left with. It has been suggested that a 1718 tourism trail should be established, but I see some problems with this. There are very few buildings left in Ulster from that 1718 period. Derry's walls, a few castles and churches, and not even Aghadowey, which dates only to the 1830s. Some of the older churches have very old gravestones, and of course there are prehistoric remains that would have been familiar landmarks to the people who left in 1718. But a heritage trail in the usual mode might be a rather thin experience. In my view, the best way to mark the tercentenary is to try to bridge the Atlantic, to try to reconnect families, to tell each half of a family what happened in subsequent generations to the other half. With the internet, it's already possible to share stories, photographs, so as to learn about a family's history, approaching it from two sides of the ocean with the knowledge that each side can produce, as I think I have done with the Fredericks family. Leonard Morrison, an important local historian of New Hampshire, wrote in 1880, "The time is coming when the fact of being a descendant of one of the first settlers of Londonderry will be considered an honour only second to being descended from one of the Pilgrim Fathers." The tercentenary should be a chance to bring the contribution of these Ulster emigrants to much wider notice in America, and just as importantly here. We could establish a 1718 society, somewhat like the well-known Mayflower Society. There could be reenactments, television documentaries, a book of essays. But ideally, we would hope to bring people together, either virtually on the internet or in reality, to experience the places that our ancestors and forebears left from or went to try to heal the wounds of long separation. It's to be hoped that in the relatively short time before 2018 that we can help people in Northern Ireland to understand the losses and the pains of separations, and that this can be conquered by a knowledge of the long-lost kin. A commemoration of the losses that started in 1718 will have to involve local people, and a very good start was made on that last year in Aghadowey when a plaque was put up to James McGregor, and there was tremendous interest and local involvement. A large part of the preparations for 2018-2019 ought to include preparing occasions to facilitate meaningful connections between tourists and locals. Our tourism initiative must stress the fact that we will be welcoming home our own people, to heal broken family links and allow people to find an important part of their missing links, their missing connections. Proper preparation and carefully researched, preferably individually targeted information will be essential, or at least desirable, for the Americans coming back to celebrate 2018. Heritage tourists, if they are properly prepared, and if we do our groundwork here, they can hope for a valuable and heartwarming experience when they visit their ancient homes. Here is another paragraph from Leonard Morrison, from whom I quoted just now, the local historian of New Hampshire. He came back to the Ballymoney area to explore his Dinsmore heritage. In this, Morrison was both prescient and inspiring. He was a pioneer heritage tourist. In the quotation with which I will finish this morning, he describes how he had been able to connect with living people who shared the landscape that his ancestors had known, and as a result, he had a greatly enhanced experience in his travels. As a result of his visit to Ballywattock, which is just outside Ballymoney, he made new friends, but he was also able to feel that he had looked out of ancestral windows at the same horizon of the Antrim Hills, with the light falling from the same angle as his ancestors had seen. And this is the quotation from Morrison. With Mr. William Hunter, an occupant of part of a Dinsmore homestead, I had enjoyed a pleasant correspondence over several years. I travelled to the home of Mr. Hunter, where he, his amiable wife, and his interesting family gave me the cheeriest welcome. They lived pleasantly and cosily in a well-constructed, good-sized stone house, built upon a portion of the homestead of Robert Dinsmore. Through the windows I looked forth upon fields familiar to and trodden by my ancestors. So there we are. That was the view that brought Leonard Morrison home. Thank you.